You're listening to the Story By podcast. This show features short fiction with two things in common. First, I wanted to share them. Second, the rights to option or produce them for other media are available. My name is Lewayne L. White. I'll be the host and narrator. Hi, welcome to the Story By podcast. I'm glad you stopped by. Today's story is The Visitation, an account of the Van Meter visitor. Van Meter is a small community south and west of Des Moines, Iowa. In the early 20th century, they experienced a brief flurry of reports of a mysterious creature roaming the streets and rooftops at night. For the last several years, Van Meter has hosted the Van Meter Visitor Festival, a community celebration of the events and an opportunity for people with an interest in the strange and unusual to get together. A friend of mine, one of the organizers of the festival, asked if I would be interested in writing a fictional piece about the visitor to be read publicly at last year's festival. I was interested, I did write it, and I did read it for an audience. And I knew when I started this show that one of the first stories I recorded would be The Visitation. Since the Van Meter Visitor Festival is this coming weekend, this seemed a good time to do it. I'll have links in the show notes with more details about the festival, as well as where you can purchase the original story. But for now, sit back, relax, and listen to Emma Nicholas's encounter with the Van Meter visitor. The Visitation, an account of the Van Meter visitor, by Lewayne L. White. September 30, 1963. Emma Nicholas eased onto her couch with a sigh and hoisted her leg, encased in a fresh cast, up onto a small stack of pillows. Her son Charles stood her crutches beside the couch and said, "I still can't believe you and Gladys were rock climbing, Ma. You're 70 years old." "Not until November, Charlie. Besides, not all of us are satisfied sitting in an office all day. Metro Insurance is a fine company, the money's good, and maybe not all of us enjoy getting dragged all over hill and dale looking for adventure." Before they could resume the same old arguments, a thundering herd of buffalo, or Charlie's 10-year-old twins Chuck and Babs, exploded into Emma's living room and slid to a stop in front of Emma. Dark-haired and dark-eyed, tall and sturdy for their age, they were the spitting image of Charlie and their grandfather, Fred. "Speak of the devils," Emma said with a smile. "Hugs, please." The kids piled onto Emma, burying her in affection and questions. "How far did you fall? Did the ropes break? Was it like flying? Is Auntie Gladys okay?" Laughing, Charlie hauled the kids off their grandmother. "Ease up, monsters. Grandma needs rest and relaxation." To Emma, he added, "That's a direct quote from Doc French." Emma waved away Charlie's and Doc French's concerns and said, "What I need is to fix supper for my guests." Charlie snorted, said, "Stay there. I'll make dinner." To Chuck and Babs, he added, "Keep Grandma resting." The trio watched him till he was out of sight in the kitchen. As soon as they heard the sound of him clattering around with pans and utensils, the twins resumed questioning Emma about her accident. They were satisfied that they had all the gory details just in time for their father to announce dinner, which, in deference to their grandmother's condition, they were allowed to eat in the living room. They sat arrayed around Emma's big Motorola TV with the stereo, and ate hamburgers and chips on Emma's TV trays while watching The Outer Limits. When the episode titled Architects of Fear concluded, Charlie sighed, shook his head, and said, "I'm going to wash the dishes, Mom." To the twins he said, "Turn off the idiot box and do something that won't rot your brain. Maybe play cards with Grandma." He walked out toward the kitchen, muttering, "Alien monsters. Ridiculous." Emma watched him go, then said, "Ridiculous, is it?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Chuck asked. "Your father knows better," Emma replied. Chuck and Babs looked at each other, then at Emma. "Dad says there's no such thing as monsters," Babs replied. "Because sometimes your dad hasn't got the brains God gave Annette," Emma said. "He grew up in Van Meter. He knows better." She glanced at the twins, added, "Don't give me that look. I'm not senile." Emma pointed at the TV. "The thing on that show? That was nothing compared to what I saw." Chuck looked intrigued. Babs looked skeptical. Both of them glanced toward the kitchen to see if their father was still busy. He didn't tell you about the Van Meter monster? The twins both shook their heads. Emma sighed, pointed toward some throw pillows on the living room chairs, said, "Grab some cushions, it's story time." The kids followed her instructions, plopped down on the pillows on the floor, and looked expectantly at Emma. Emma glanced again toward the kitchen, then back toward the children, and said, "When I was about your age, I saw a creature the likes of which I'd never seen before, nor since." Babs counted quickly on her fingers, blinked, then blurted out, "In 1903? Chuck turned to Babs and said, "Grandma's not that old." "I most certainly am," Emma replied. "I was born in 1893. Now, Chuck looked skeptical, and Babs looked intrigued. 60 years ago, Emma said, almost exactly as a matter of fact, my little hometown became the site of some strange goings-on. The first night. Emma couldn't sleep. She turned over for about the millionth time, but couldn't get comfortable. It was nearly midnight by then, but she just felt restless and fidgety. Finally, with a sigh, she got up, dug her overalls out from under her bed, and with one eye on her sleeping sisters, Gladys and Frances, got dressed. A moment later, she hoisted the window, glancing back at her sisters when the frame squeaked, then slipped out onto the porch roof. Emma sat for a time, just feeling the breeze brush her skin. She looked up at the waxing moon, connected dots with the stars, and listened to the rustle of the few leaves left on the old maple beside the house. She finally decided that maybe a walk would tire her out. She moseyed to the edge of the roof, took a few steps back, then dashed forward and leaped into the air. For a moment, Emma enjoyed the sensation of flight, then she caught a fat branch of the maple and, hand over hand, made her way to the trunk. She shimmied down till her feet touched the ground, then headed off at a casual pace. Emma drifted through downtown Van Meter, passing the various shops, Mr. Moore's restaurant with the pies that were better than Mama's, Sweezy's and Van Schock's meat markets. Mama preferred Sweezy's. The drugstore where Dr. Summers had the fancy perfumes that smelled like flowers, along with all the medicines a person could ever need. Emma rounded a corner and stopped dead when she saw Mr. Griffith. She guessed Ulysses Griffith must be coming back to town after making his rounds selling implements. But he seemed frozen in place, staring at something up and out of Emma's sight. She craned around and saw that he was looking at the roof of Mather and Gregg's building. A light moved around up there, something with a beam like a miner's lamp. Then, as Emma and Mr. Griffith stared, the light dashed across the street to another roof as if shot by a gun. Mr. Griffith swung his head to follow the light's path, and when it disappeared from sight, Mr. Griffith rushed up the street to the implement store he shared with his brother. Emma darted off in the direction the light had taken, hoping to see where it went, but a few moments of fruitless searching convinced her that she'd missed her chance to follow it. Finally, she gave up and returned home to bed. The second night. Emma couldn't sleep. Again. By the time Emma had left school that afternoon, she'd heard from a dozen different kids about the light. Of course, most of the stories were wrong, but no one believed Emma when she said she'd seen it too. Shortly before 1 a.m., Emma slipped out of the house the same way she had the previous night. She made her way back to downtown Van Meter, keeping her eyes upward, scanning the tops of the storefronts for the strange light. A thunder crack of sound stopped Emma in her tracks. She recognized it as a gunshot and sprinted off in the direction she thought it had come from. 4 more shots rang out, loud and concussive, echoing off the walls of the stores. Emma rounded a corner and saw the back window of Dr. Alcott's just as the light swept past her. Emma froze. Something huge and inhuman hung from a telephone pole across the street from her. It moved strangely as it descended, and Emma was reminded of her Uncle George's parrot that climbed up and down in its cage, using its beak like hands. Except this creature's wings didn't look feathered. They looked like skin stretched between tree branches, like the wings on the bat that had gotten loose in the school a few weeks ago. As Emma tried to commit the image to memory, a light flashed past her again, and she realized there was some sort of horn or something sticking out of the creature's head, and the light appeared to be coming from there. The thing reached the ground, scuttled along on its back legs, using the long point of the wings as front legs. Emma stood frozen, watching the creature's bizarre movements. She heard people, probably roused by gunshots, approaching. She looked in the direction for a second to see if she'd been spotted, then looked back. The creature had disappeared. Emma decided she better do likewise. The third night. The town was on edge. Mr. Griffith coming home late and seeing a spook light was one thing. But Dr. Alcott firing off a gun in the middle of the night was a different thing altogether. He wasn't given to flights of fancy as far as the people of Van Meter were concerned. When Emma went to the hardware store with her father earlier that day, she saw several men buying ammunition. All of them discussed the events of the previous night in as much detail as if they had been there. They hadn't been, of course, but Emma had, and her curiosity was raised. After seeing the mysterious creature the night before, she had chastised herself for getting distracted and losing track of it. Shortly after midnight, as Emma dressed to go out again, she tucked a pencil and some folded pieces of paper into the pocket of her overalls. She hoped to get a better look at the thing and, if time allowed, get a sketch of it. As she raised the window, put a leg over the sill, she heard a whispered, "Emma!" Emma sighed.
"Go back to sleep, Gladys. What you doing?" "Sneaking out." "What about the thing Doc Alcott shot?" "He didn't shoot it. He shot at it. I saw it last night."
Gladys's eyes grew as big as Mama's fancy china plates, and she said,
"Ain't you afraid?" "Scared yellow,"
Emma said, and ducked out the window before Gladys could say any more. She crossed the roof, launched herself to the tree branch, made her way to the ground, and repeated her path from the house to downtown. The creature seemed to have appeared there twice. If it showed up again, Emma figured that meant some sort of pattern. She crept along the street, sticking to the shadows, when a flash of light from up the street caught her attention. Emma stopped sneaking and ran toward it. The thing stood in the middle of the street, wings spread. The light atop its head beamed straight at the side of the Van Meter bank. It was almost as if it had posed just for Emma. She grabbed her pencil and paper and began to sketch the creature. Emma had just outlined the thing's shape when the light swept across her. She looked right into the glare of the creature's headlight. It opened its beak and began to make awful noises, like someone strangling. Emma wanted to cover her ears against the sound, wanted to run, but she squinted her eyes, tried to keep sketching. The monster's light flashed toward the bank, and it opened its beak wide, uttering more horrible sounds. Then an explosion of buckshot and glass staggered the creature. Emma shouted, "No!" before she could stop herself, and ran toward the beast. Emma would learn later that Peter Dunn had been waiting in the bank with a shotgun, and had awakened to find the fiend looking in at him. At that moment, all she knew was that the creature flapped its wings as if to flee. She raced toward it, unsure what her plan actually was, as the thing lifted off. "No, no, no, no!" Emma repeated as it landed on a nearby rooftop and disappeared into the darkness. "No!" she hollered one last time and stamped her foot on the dirt of the street. She looked down, frustrated, angry, and saw something that made her eyes widen and her heart leap. Near her own small boot prints were several bizarre three-toed animal tracks in the soft dirt. Emma shrieked in excitement. "Is someone out there?" Peter Dunn yelled from inside the bank. "I have a shotgun!" Emma said a word she'd heard Pa use when he smashed his thumb with a hammer, and then she ran. The fourth night. Near midnight, Emma sat hunkered down under the awning of Smith's photography to keep out of the rain. She wondered if it would keep the beast from emerging from wherever it hid. With a sigh, she looked longingly at the window of the photo gallery and wished she could get a hold of one of Smith's cameras. She'd brought her papers and pencil, but a picture would be even better. It would be something real. Emma heard someone yell in the distance, leapt up, and ran for the source of the noise. As she approached Fisher & White's hardware, lightning flashed, and she saw it. The monster crouched atop a telephone pole across from the hardware store like some sort of fiend from a Sunday school story. Its headlight seemed aimed at a window on the second floor. The creature opened its beak and a horrific noise boiled forth. The monster's awful sounds were drowned out by a rumble that Emma had first took to be thunder. Then it occurred again, and she realized someone in the store had fired a gun. Through the rain, Emma thought she could make out the face of O.V. White, the store owner, in the muzzle flash of his next shot. Apparently unfazed, the beast screeched at Mr. White, then proceeded to crawl down the pole in the same unsettling bird-like manner Emma had seen before. It reached the ground, stood its full height, swept its light around, unfurled its wings, and shrieked. "Dear God, what is that thing?" Startled, Emma realized that Sidney Gregg stood on his store's porch across the street, a pistol dangling in his hand. He raised his free hand to his face and added, "And what is that stink?" Emma noticed it too, an unpleasant rotten egg smell that burned her nose and eyes. It made her feel woozy, and for a moment the beast seemed almost to fade from her sight. With a series of awkward leaps, like an upright rabbit, the creature hopped off into the darkness.
"It's headed toward the mines!"
Mr. Gregg hollered, then suddenly seemed struck silent as the monstrosity passed. Emma pursued the beast. She knew she wouldn't be able to sit for a week when Mr. Gregg told her pa that she'd been out of the house in the middle of the night, but she had to know what happened. The thing bounded along the streets of Van Meter with Emma trying to keep up. As she followed, she became aware of an approaching rumble. A beam of light struck Emma, and she thought the creature had turned to confront her. A second later, she realized the source of both the noise and the light was the approaching Mail Express train. With a gasp, she realized the monster was headed for the tracks, and for a split second, she was sure the train would strike the thing. But it lunged across the rails just before the train passed, and Emma stood helpless, unable to follow, as she saw the monster leap up and sail away into the darkness. The final nights. Emma waited all day for her mother or father to mention that Mr. Gregg had seen her out in the middle of the night chasing monsters, but neither ever did. As they all sat around the table for dinner Friday night, Emma's pa mentioned, "That fellow owns the hardware, White. He says he saw the monster this morning. Said he shot it, but didn't hurt it. Of course, he also says the thing gassed him or something, and he doesn't recollect much."
"Amy Thurston told me at school that Mr. Gregg saw it too, that he chased it away,"
Emma said, waiting to see pa's response. "He says he got gassed too. Stood there and watched it fly away. Fool forgot he had a gun in his hand," pa said.
"Did he see anything else?"
Emma asked. Gladys looked over at Emma, and Emma shushed her with a glare. Pa shrugged, added, "Gregg said he was fuzzy. Doesn't recollect much more than it seemed headed over toward the mines." Mama, whose brothers all worked for the nearby Platt Brick and Tile Factory, looked horror-struck and said,
"Do you think it lives in the mines?"
Pa snorted, said, "I ain't even sure there's an it, let alone that it's living in the mines." Frances, who was in high school and thought she knew more than everyone, said,
"Professor Martin says there is a creature, and it's an antediluvian." "Antediluvian," Emma corrected. "It means it came from before the flood in the Bible." "Were you there?" Frances replied and stuck her tongue out at Emma. "I was, and I'm pretty sure he said antediluvian."
Emma shook her head, exasperated, and resumed eating.
"One of those fellas, Bob Stone, that works over to Platt's factory, says he and the guys heard sounds like Satan and a regiment of imps coming from some of the old shafts," Frances added. Mama crossed herself at the thought. Bob's also been known to spend most his time up to Ethel Logan's tavern. "I ain't put much stock in what he says," Pa said. With that, the conversation moved on to other gossip. Widow Marston's trip to Omaha, Gladys's new teacher, June Western's new baby, and everyone forgot about the creature stalking Van Meter. Well, everyone but Emma, who decided she was headed over to the brick factory and the nearby mines after everyone went to bed. That night, she just started tugging her boots on when she heard hollering outside. Emma hoisted the window and leaned out into the spitting rain. Lights had started popping on in houses up and down the street, and a few people leaned out of their front doors.
"It's at the mines," a man hollered. "I saw the monster. Get your guns, boys."
Emma heard a commotion downstairs, followed by her father yelling out the front door below her. "What the Sam Hill's all the ruckus?"
"It's the monster," someone replied. "Platt Jr. saw two of them out to the mines."
Another voice bellowed, "He saw them fly away and sent some of us round to gather up men for an ambush when they come back." Emma crept out onto the porch roof, lying flat against the wet shingles near the edge, trying to hear over the rain and all the fuss in town. "Now there's two of them?" Pa replied.
"Yep, big un and a little one."
"How many you got going?" Pa asked. "Looks like the whole town's lit up." "Every able-bodied man in town with a gun." "Well, then you probably don't need me," Pa replied, and shut the door.
"I never figured Fred for yellow,"
said the first voice. "He ain't yellow," said the second voice. "He fought in one of them wars between the Injuns and the Army. I heard he got shot with 6 arrows."
"That why he has that limp?"
said the first voice. "I reckon," said the second. Anything after that faded away as they moved up the street to the next houses. As far as Emma knew, her pa had never been in the Army, and he limped because a snake spooked a horse he was riding. They both took a tumble, and the horse landed on his leg. Either way, she wouldn't have to worry about pa spotting her out at the mine. When the coast was clear, Emma threw herself out onto the maple branch, then made her way to the ground. After a moment's pause to again check for witnesses, she ran off in the direction of the mines. By the time she got there and found some cover behind some bushes, she would have sworn that every able-bodied man, except for Pa, really was waiting to ambush the creatures. She even saw boys who went to school with Francis duck down, sweeping their squirrel guns across the sky as if expecting the beast to swoop down and snatch them up. After a moment, Emma looked up to make sure they weren't. The rain pelted down on everyone, then periodically broke for a while, then resumed the type of drizzle that makes everything wet, but never seems serious enough to do crops any good. Men got fidgety, boys got drowsy, and grumbling began amongst them all. Eventually, without planning to, Emma dozed off.
"Here they come!"
Someone roared, startling Emma and waking her from the nap she didn't know she'd taken. Still fuzzy from sleep, she tried to focus, and saw several men pointing into the sky to the east. Emma blinked at the creeping light of the sunrise and muttered, "It's just daybreak." Then she saw them. Two of the creatures, one much bigger than the other, sailed up into view, wings spread, beaks open, making a terrible noise that sounded like someone grinding metal. Emma slapped her hands over her mouth to keep from crying out in surprise. She quickly moved her hands to cover her nose as the stench of the night before swept over her, as if driven by the monster's wings.
"Sweet Christmas!"
someone bellowed.
"What is that stink?"
"Shoot 'em down, boys!" another man hollered. Emma had to cover her ears against the thunderous sound of dozens of rifles and shotguns firing into the approaching dawn. The volley seemed to last for days, and when it finally died off, Emma looked up, expecting to see dead, mangled monsters lying on the ground. Instead, she saw the two creatures land as if they dropped from no farther than Emma's porch roof to the ground. The men stood stupefied, questioning either their marksmanship or their faith, as the monsters scuttled along and disappeared into the mouth of one of the mine shafts. Some men reloaded, aimed at the opening as if expecting the fiends to emerge with reinforcements, but none came. Emma took this as a sign the show was over and began creeping away, so she could run back home before the house woke up. As she took off, she heard a man say,
"Well, hell, sun's up. I got chores to do."
A few more men murmured agreement, and the crowd began to disperse. Emma made it home, up the tree, across the porch roof, in the window, and discovered her father sitting on her bed. I reckon you've got some explaining to do," he said, and unfolded the paper with her sketch of the monster. She began. He tossed her some coins. "Head back down the way you came. Get over to Manbeck's. Your mama believes I sent you out early to get my tobacco." "Yes, sir." Emma returned in record time, came in through the kitchen door, and saw the family in the dining room finishing their breakfast. "Pa said you went to fetch," Mama began. "His tobacco, yes, ma'am," Emma interrupted. "I told her it weren't cause to hold breakfast," Pa added. "No, sir," Emma replied. She handed Pa his tobacco pouch, returned to the kitchen, pumped some water into a basin, and washed her hands and face. "I hear the boys think they got the monster trapped in one of the old mine shafts," Pa said. Emma looked up. "They're holding a meeting to decide what's to be done." September 30, 1963. Charlie walked into the living room with a suitcase in his hand and said, "You telling the story, Emma and the Van Meter monsters?" "Yeah," Chuck said, and added, "The townspeople have them trapped in the old mine shaft." Charlie sighed, shook his head, and said, "And they boarded up the mines and no one ever saw or heard from them again. Come on, my monsters. Mama's here to take you home." "But, Dad," Babs said. "But, Dad, nothing. You have school tomorrow. You can visit Grandma after that." "You better get going," Emma said. "Hugs, please." The kids piled onto Emma, hugged her several times, then thundered out as they had come in. Charlie gestured with the suitcase, said, "Rachel brought me some clothes so I can stay over in case you need help getting around." Emma waved his concern away and said, "I'll be fine." Charlie kissed her on the forehead. "I know you will. You faced down the Van Meter monsters. I'm going to throw this case up in the guest room. I'll be back in a minute." Mid-October, 1903. Emma couldn't sleep. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the creatures disappeared into the mine, and the men of the town had boarded up all the entrances. No one had seen hide nor hair nor a leathery wing of the monsters, including Emma. She sat on the porch roof, listening to the rustle of the few dead leaves that remained on the maple beside it. The sky was clear, the moon was new, the stars were bright, and Emma felt like something was missing. She was startled when she heard, "Hey, Em," from the ground below her. She crawled to the edge of the roof and saw Pa standing, looking up at her and holding a lantern. "Get down here," he said. She caught the maple branch, shimmied down the tree, and touched the ground. "Your ma'd have a kitten if she knew you were doing that," Pa said.
"You gonna tell her?"
"Don't care much for kittens," he said, and started off walking. Emma followed him and said,
"Where are we going?"
"You'll see." After some time, Pa led her to a hole in the ground a short distance from the mines.
"What's that?"
Emma asked. "Imagine it was meant to be an air shaft," Pa said as he lit the lantern and placed it beside the hole. Emma crouched down to take a closer look and saw gouges along the edge of the shaft.
"Are those claw marks?"
Emma asked. Pa shrugged, picked up the lantern. Emma followed and saw a series of three-toed prints in the dirt leading away from the hole. "Someone said Pete Dunn has a plaster cast of some strange footprints," Pa said. "I ain't seen 'em, but they sounded a lot like these." Pa stopped at the end of the trail of prints, said, "I guess they took off from here. Flying, jumping, whatever it is they do." Emma looked out toward the darkness.
"You think they're gone forever?"
"Probably depends on how good your memory is," Pa replied. September 30, 1963. Emma sat on her couch with a cup of tea in her hand. Charlie sat in an easy chair and drank from a cup of coffee. After a while, he said, "Why do you keep telling that story, Mom?" Emma shrugged. "I suppose, so I don't forget it." Thanks for hanging out today. If you're interested in learning more about the Van Meter Visitor, or checking out the Visitor Festival, head over to the blog for show notes and links. That's at storybypodcastblog.wordpress.com. If you liked the show, please tell your friends, and if you didn't like the show, tell me. You can reach me at storybypodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter at storybypodcast, on Facebook at facebook.com/storybypodcast. You can also now subscribe on iTunes, so you'll always be up to date on the current episodes, and don't have to wait around for me to post the show link. That also means you have the opportunity to rate the show. If you love it, a 5-star review would be great. If you didn't love it, you know how to get in touch with me. Today's episode included the following music provided by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com, and edited by Lewayne L. White. Impact Moderato, opening and closing of the episode, and This House, opening and closing of the story. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.